Welcome to Nhlpa, a mental health podcast for everyone. Since our first episode in 2016, we have been sharing stories of recovery, engaging with experts, and tackling the stigma associated with mental illness. The Nhlpa podcast is produced by Ontario Shore's Centre for Mental Health Sciences and is available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to the Nhlpa podcast. This is episode 95, and my name is Darryl Mathers. I'm your host for this episode, as we're going to talk one of our favorite subjects, or two of our favorite subjects, mental health, obviously being our mental health podcast, but being in Canada and being at the center, close to the center of the hockey universe, we tend to have a lot of our guests that do have a hockey connection. And our next guest has not only a strong mental health connection, a strong hockey connection, but also a connection to Ontario Shore. So I'm pleased to welcome former NHL defenseman Jay Harrison. And before I officially welcome you, Jay, everybody will know you obviously from playing with the Leafs, the Carolina Hurricanes, the Winnipeg Jets, the Oshawa Legionnaires for those locally. And you're currently a mental health counselor. And you spent some time after hockey working on your next career at Ontario Shore. So lots of connections here. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Darryl. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about your story, I remember when you actually did come to Ontario Shore, the buzz about having a hockey player at the hospital, quickly made the rounds. And you have a bit of an unusual path, right? Like a lot of former hockey players maybe do the rubber chicken circuit, or they open up hockey camps in schools, stay in the game in a more traditional way. You're staying in the game in, a bit of an unconventional way. So talk about how, a little bit about what you're doing now and how, during your journey as a hockey player that kind of shaped all that.
Yeah, thank you. I do. I reflect so fondly on my time at Ontario Shores. It was a huge part of my professional development and a huge aspect of my transition out of the game, and it kind of formed a bit of a backdrop. And as I look back now at what is somewhat of a difficult time in an athlete's life, an area that I've dedicated a great deal of the second part of my career towards understanding and supporting this transition aspect, I look back now at my time at Ontario Shores and the relationships and mentorship that I received there, and the exposure that I got, which looking back now was so powerful and instrumental in my development. So I'm happy to share how I got to Ontario Shores, and certainly some of the things that I took with there from my experiences there onto the new work and ventures that I'm continuing to explore. So my path into mental health wasn't necessarily a straight line. I didn't always know that I wanted to be involved in it, but certainly as I got to understand myself better and evaluate the game as well, and better understand the experience of being a professional athlete and all of the aspects that come with it, I'd like to say the good, the bad, and the ugly, I started to recognize that there is a gap there, particularly relating to the high performance culture, not just in sports, in hockey generally, but extending it into other sports and even elite environments where mental health is a difficult thing to talk about, it's a difficult thing to understand, and it's a difficult place to seek help. And it aligned very well, understanding mental health, aligned very well with my development educationally. I was always a very active student. It's a big part of me being a player. I was always academically inclined. I loved doing school. I actually found it had a huge performance enhancing effect on me, which, as we'll get to later, is where my doctoral research was in, and better understanding how things that you do outside of sport impact your mental well-being and even your performance in sport. But I always found that it was an edge for me. It gave me an ability to be resilient. I wasn't just tied to the results of the game. And my education continually took me towards psychology. My mentor, Dr. Larry Cash, would say I'm a very insightful personality, which means I ask why a lot, which is an excellent place to be in psychology, because you get to ask why a lot and conceptualize quite a bit, and continue to learn more, and also find new things in myself, what I might be capable of and where my skill sets lie. So, continually going through my career and getting educated. I had the fortune of playing professional hockey for 15 years. I was able to accumulate a lot of courses over that time and leave the game with a master's degree in clinical counseling. And part of that degree was a clinical internship for 1 year And I was fortunate enough to be connected with some people at Ontario Shores, which provided me with some clinical supervision and mentorship, which is where I was ultimately able to fulfill that requirement of my degree and then move on to become a professional counselor in North Carolina.
It's very interesting when I think about, your career. You weren't a first round pick, who was, earmarked to be in the NHL right off the bat. You really earned your stripes, paid your dues, spent a time in the minors before, you eventually, became a regular, I'd say, in Carolinas, where you kind of really established yourself. But during that time, I would think, you're a little bit younger than me, but I would think that you were still living in old school hockey world. Like when you said you like to ask the question why, I just imagine some of your coaches not necessarily being thrilled with always being asked why, but like what was it? You must have been one of the very few players striving academically when you were in the minors, or were you? Like, is that just maybe that's a stereotype?
Well, there is all kinds. Certainly, as the game has evolved and changed over the past decade, you're starting to see more and more of what we call this career engagement strategy. Proactively exercising career development behaviors, whether that's through skills and knowledge acquisition, whether it's through networking, career planning, development. But yeah, I come from a time where that was relatively limited. Because of this, there just tends to be a mindset, especially with elite athletes, because of the temporary nature of the job. If you're not all in, you're out. And the fact that it could be taken from you every day actually doesn't, support the idea of expanding your scope. It makes you double down. It's kind of an interesting observation that the more you try to orient athletes to say you need a plan B, the more you're telling them to emphasize plan A. Because it's so dire and could happen so quickly. So, going forward, changing the script and the talking points and the whole, ethos of that is starting to change. And we're starting to recognize that may not necessarily be the case. But for me, yeah, I was somewhat selective with those why conversations, but always found teammates, friends to gravitate towards. And, even I found I have incredibly lasting relationships in the game through medical staff that I played with, physicians, psychologists, trainers, strength and conditioning coaches that I've formed some incredibly strong relationships with. And those relationships were really founded and reinforced through exploring conversations outside the game, whether they were philosophical, whether they were nutritional, psychological, medical, all of these aspects. Just I have this unquenchable thirst to learn and acquire knowledge and continue to evolve in that respect. So there's no shortage of information and conversations if you just go find them. But the education and balancing the two things that sometimes throws people for a bit of a loop and how you might be able to do that. So I've spent a lot of time reflecting on how that actually came to be and how athletes can be more effective. Very structured people, but tend not to challenge the power structure. I never asked many coaches why. Darryl.
Yeah.
Those weren't the ones you asked why.
Yeah, that's probably a good career move.
Right.
But as you went through that process, because I'm guessing it, towards the end of the career, you transition from just being interested in academia to more focused on, mental health as your second career. Was it common that, people knew what you were striving for? Did players come up to you and ask you questions about how the brain works or mental health or what they were struggling? Did any of those kind of things happen at the end of your career?
They certainly did. And I guess that's also, part, I think, of the attraction to the role as well, is the sense of mentorship. And often found myself to be a very effective catalyst. And I kind of look at the counseling role as like a true catalyst for change. And, a catalyst comes along like an enzyme and plugs itself in, and a chemical reaction occurs. And then the enzyme goes its own way and the cell goes its own way. Nothing left behind, nothing taken with it. Really encapsulate what the counselor does. It just, facilitates something to happen for the individual, whatever that might be, and then goes on its way, leaving nothing and taking nothing. And I did find that did start to happen. It was leading by example, if you will. People started asking more questions. How do you do it? Why do you do it? What does it mean? Why don't you just be a hockey player? And it also actually was incredibly, therapeutic for me to better understand why I was doing it too. I didn't necessarily come to mental health because I had the answers or because I was, the vision of what mental health could look like in sport. In fact, quite the opposite. A number of the aspects of being drawn towards learn more about mental health more generally come from my own struggles. While maybe not classifiable as, diagnostic or clinical in that sense, certainly my experience through the game and well-being took a beating. And better understanding that and being an advocate for myself, I think, is ultimately part of any counselor's journey. How can I help others? How can I help myself? How can I learn through my experiences to help others? So people would often ask a lot, and it would come up, and it's just a great feeling to be able to connect someone to a resource, whether it's facilitative, like someone who wants to do something, career development, learn something about education, starting a small business, anything like that, or it's something a little bit more serious where someone says, my relationship is struggling right now, neither one of us are happy, and we don't know what to do. And it's an incredibly powerful privilege to be the first person to be told that in any situation. So, that sense of leadership and honor also comes with this as well, which I obviously fed on and enjoyed. And getting the education was critically important to do this work for me. Advocacy is very important, and we need advocates everywhere. But one of the things that athletes tend to do is they're really good at putting up barriers, and they're really good at distancing themselves from others who don't share similar experiences. It's a very easy diffuser of any serious conversation is you don't understand what I'm going through, because most people don't. So, part of the strategy I was relying on becoming a counselor was also this aspect is that I'm actually building on a foundation of the ability to build rapport and connection to the real lived experience of these particular individuals, and to be able to identify with their struggles in a way that's authentic and genuine, that may disarm some of that defensiveness early. Was I thought this could be a really cool opportunity to make real change and address a serious gap in the service provision for elite athletes.
It's an interesting time in the world, but as it relates to hockey in terms of like change and meeting the needs of not just the modern day athlete, but the modern day person, which I would guess professional sports hasn't been great historically at developing the person. They've been focused on the physical abilities of that individual rather than any emotional or mental health needs. But you're seeing a shift now where not just in hockey but in the world, where mental health is not just about going to see somebody when you're struggling. It's about taking care of your mind at different points of of a season, of a year, whatever the case may be. In your career, as it related to the topic of mental health, whether that meant like the accessibility of counselors or psychiatrists or psychologists at a team level to, whatever you need, did you see kind of the evolution during your time that maybe you just didn't go to a counselor when things were in a dire point? Players could go even if things were going well in terms of like maintaining their mental health. Did that kind of stuff happen when you were still playing?
Well, I think that's the gift of the change that you're talking about, is this trend towards mental health isn't the absence of illness or the absence of symptomology, right? There's a thriving component, the well-being component is really, I think, what the catalyst is here. And this generation, what's being reinforced now and recognized, is the opportunity positive mental health has, specifically as it relates to performance. So for whatever reason, those two aspects were largely disconnected, and in some ways out of sight, out of mind. None of our business, not our problem. There are reasons the hockey culture and elite sports culture is not just hockey. There's you could write books and books on it. But the idea that now players athletes are looking at their mental health and the positive status of their mental health and well-being as a performance edge, I think is the critical step that had to ultimately be made, is connecting those two. And that has come with an enormous amount of work to destigmatize and reorient what mental health means and what it actually is and how it exists along a continuum. All of those factors that those working in mental health advocacy and support clinically have been working towards orienting and educating people and society more broadly. I think sports is really catching on. and you're starting to hear players talk about, well, if I'm feeling better, if I'm doing better, if I'm more optimistic, I'm going to perform better. Now there's a vested interest. It's aligned with what they want. Too many times, just like I talked about earlier, the plan A versus plan B conversation, they're only going to adopt and adapt to what is aligned with what they're ultimately trying to achieve. So, aligning things, whether they are, adaptive mental health strategies and positive well-being or career development, career enhancement outside the game, if we can align those and demonstrate their ability to support the performance, which is the ultimate goal, it has been since they're 4, we're going to get far greater engagement in using those resources and making connections and ultimately being able to make a difference.
Yeah. It's interesting, just the language that's changed too. Like, I know hockey's notorious for not disclosing injuries, but you have seen instances where, whether it's Carey Price or other athletes who have had short-term or long-term mental health issues where it's been disclosed, where it's been public. And I would guess that, for somebody who's going through that, like, the last thing you need is more layers of, like, whether it's a stigma or fear. Like, the fact that we can, in hockey and other sports, that we can say what it is, that it's anxiety or depression or substance abuse, would be freeing a little bit for some players, or at least maybe improving the environment, for present day players or future players. I'm not sure if that's something you agree with.
Yeah, I think there's, that recognition of the strength and vulnerability, that dialect there, I think is coming to the recognition, and players have to, as much as anyone, is that we're largely the same as everyone else. Probably about 98% of our daily functioning and our experiences. All the epidemiological data supports that elite athletes are at least as likely to deal with mental health issues as the average people in their in their demographic. And they may even be at more risk based on the unique work circumstances, the pressures that come with that, and the consistent evaluative nature of an elite athletic environment may actually create even unique factors. And now there's part of recognizing that, and one way to deal with them is to ignore them and assume they don't exist, and another way is to acknowledge them and work with them rather than working against them. And I think some athletes are being unbelievable role models in that respect, and saying, well, I'm going to deal with mine up front. And in my experience as well, while the game has been criticized for certain aspects within those locker rooms, as a player, no one has ever been ostracized in my experience because of that. In fact, it's the most welcoming group. They're family. We're family to each other, and we embrace each other for our issues. To my experience, none of the stigma around mental health, at least in our sport, pertains that, well, I'm a hockey player, and because I'm a hockey player, I can't have mental health issues, or my teammates are going to judge me. The stigma is far more systemic, in that it's, what if somebody finds out and I'm going to lose my job? Similar to what you might see in a first responders environment, where there's real, economic consequences that must be considered, right? So it's an interesting, dynamic where players aren't really worried about having mental health because of what it means to who they are, but rather how it's perceived by the more general culture. And as it relates to their career viability and sustainability, which, as a former player is always threatened. It's threatened every day. It's a nature of the job. So I think that's why we have great caution in disclosing those, and to have some of those players come out and openly acknowledge and demonstrate to others that this is a way to handle these particular challenges as well is really encouraging and supportive for everyone.
Can you explain a little bit about your role within the NHLPA? And you're wearing your NHLPA hat, and I know you work with players. So how does it, how does your role, I guess, work? Whether it aligns or works differently than what resources might be available to players through their team. Like, what role do you play?
Sure. I was brought on by Don Fear and Matthew Schneider as a consultant to the NHLPA. My title I work under is the Wellness Transition and Performance Specialist. And after being in the PA, being on the executive board for several years, negotiating collective bargaining agreements, And this was an area that we continue to look to evolve, and what else can we do to bring value to our players' lives and support their daily functioning, not just as players in a labor perspective or in an economic perspective, but also how can we support them living their best lives through the game. We know that the NHLPA has amazing resources. Our player assistance programs are as good as any offered through any workplace. They're elite, the elite of the elite. But we continually come to that challenge as players is that we're isolated, and it becomes difficult to get players connected to those resources in a timely fashion. So my role specifically is acting as a liaison for our players, and to better align them and orient them to the resources that they need, whether they be in a mental health in a crisis capacity, ensuring they get to the appropriate clinicians to be evaluated and taken care of and get those resources they need, all the way to working with players who may have more facilitative issues, like they're looking to expand and develop in their career space outside the game, and how we align them with our programmatic offerings that support career and professional development. It could be extended family services, all the way to offering peer-to-peer support for guys in their actual day-to-day performance as players. My unique experience professionally as both a player and then now as someone working in psychology gives me the versatility to have some unique conversations with players, none of them clinical, but to ensure that those players have a soft landing point and can have a conversation with someone who genuinely understands and empathizes with what their current circumstance might be, and increase the likelihood that they'll reach out. So to date, it's been very successful. Guys are generally very open, but to have a shared experience of being former players and then helping guys align to those resources and maximize that at an early proactive stage is something we continue to work towards and develop. So it's a very exciting thing to be a part of, and to grow as well, along with the PA, to support our players both in their career development, but also in their mental health and well-being for themselves and their families.
Yeah. I was mentioning, just before we started filming, about the Seattle Kraken posting something related. I think it was around Bell Let's Talk, but it was related to mental health. And they were talking about, one of the players was talking about reaching out to you, when they were struggling. And I would imagine, you're not too far removed from the game. And that, like you mentioned earlier, players are people, 98%. I forget what that number was, but essentially, they're no less or more likely to have a mental health issue than anybody else. But they live in a different world, right? Especially the young players who may not have gone through different milestones in life yet. They've been living and breathing hockey their whole lives. People may not appreciate 12 months of the year what these kids are doing, and when they get to that level, what they've been through already at 23, 24 years old, and it must be it must help, I guess, and you kind of alluded to it, but build that trust already when you're so in your history in the game, coupled with your experience now. Is it a bridge builder? I'm guessing your experience.
Yeah, that's precisely what it is. That's the best analogy to it. And I think even expanding, that's what my role is to be a bridge, right? And the whole goal of it is to just increase the opportunities for players to connect and reach out to a familiar face, right? So developing relationships with these players, understanding what they're going through, their unique circumstances. And there's a whole bunch of unique circumstances that mark the ups and downs of a professional sports career. Like in our sport specifically, you have players getting called up, getting sent down, right? You have players on long-term injury. You have players on buyouts, right? There's a number of different circumstances that you may not necessarily appreciate, and its impact or the toll it may take on your day-to-day functioning. So if there's an ongoing supportive peer-to-peer relationship going on, and you've had conversations with players, not just when things aren't so good, but when things are going well, it creates and fosters an opportunity that may decrease the energy it takes to pick up the phone. That's really kind of what I talk about. The biological analogy I like to use is I want to reduce the activation energy it takes to pick up the phone. Very hard to call someone you don't know on the worst day of your life, let alone the best day of your life. So, the idea is that we can have some of these conversations and make these connections and reflect to them, educate them on the resources that they have, orient them, giving them the knowledge, skills, and awareness to, better assess their own functioning and their functioning of their teammates. will go a long way in how well they use the resources provided, and we can continue to support their development in that way. That's what I largely see as my mission: is how do I find better ways for players to be their own self-advocates and be self-directed in their own health and well-being, which is somewhat of a gap that elite sport does create. Through my experiences, as you talked about, we focus on since we're very, very young. Oftentimes we live a very directed life and we're very responsive, but that at some level impairs our ability to be autonomous and proactive and seek initiative for our own issues. So part of the overarching strategy is to continue to cultivate and develop. And to be clear, those strategies are very effective in sport. We talk about things like coachability, responsiveness, adversity, things like that. You need someone who's somewhat responsive to an environment to thrive. But also recognizing that other areas of our life may require more self-directed behavior, and the ability to have the awareness that maybe a couple good games may not fix what's happening, which tends to be the default setting.
Whether it's with your role with the PA or just in your experience of being a player who's left the game and started a second career, that transition from being a player to not being a player anymore, to me, it sounds like it'd be very difficult. Because very few players leave on their own terms. Usually the game tells you when it's time for you to leave and do something else. Have you worked with former players, or is that something that the PA does, or you do, or is it something you've supported just as a friend of former players? Is that even an area of struggle or concern of players who are kind of transitioning out of the game and into who knows what and trying to maintain their mental health at the same time?
No, it most definitely is an area of conflict, specifically from an identity perspective and a psychosocial functioning as well. Remember, when someone transitions from sport, like you said, it's usually not on your own terms. You didn't see it coming for the past 5 years, although it may have been the writing on the wall. You're still always believing in yourself that you're going to be your best and continue to overcome. But you combine that with the significant loss in identity, both inter and introspectively, how people see you, how you see yourself, the social circle that you lose, the supportive structure around you is no longer present. There's a whole bunch of self-efficacy that goes out the window, and like the perceived abilities that you may have of being so specialized from such an early age, you may not see yourself as particularly capable. So you combine all of these factors, and it's there's a lot of risks, and makes it a very tumultuous time in an athlete's career. And getting a little psychological on the research, we kind of call the transition a liminal experience. If you look at some of the research coming out of particularly University of Florida, has done a great job in capturing, and applying a bit of an Ericksonian approach to this period of life and calling it, a stage of moratorium, if you will. And, we look at this stage where people aren't what they were, but not yet what they're going to be. So it's a very uncomfortable purgatory-esque type area of identity and career development, which can be very uncomfortable for athletes. And, I've certainly noticed that, and the research would suggest that the more prepared you are for that, the less time you tend to spend in that unknown period. Everybody does, with the degree of exploration and commitment necessary to transition from a career. But without doing a great deal of work, it can be a place where you get stuck. Especially the big risk factors. If you look at the research, there's actually a former hockey player named Dr. Peter Aston out of Stanford, whose research shows the risks for depression and anxiety in retired professional hockey players is social isolation. It's losing that social network. So, part of that career development path and that positive well-being is recognizing that your transition doesn't start the day you retire or the day you no longer play. This is something that, needs to be forecasted in the foresight and developed over time. And we encourage athletes, I certainly do, is that this is a 5-year process. And when you walk out of the game, whenever that might be, you're starting to execute on a plan rather than starting to formulate an idea of what could be. And I think the most important part of that is overcoming that stigma around, well, if I'm doing that, then I'm selling myself out. If I'm planning my career after sports, somehow I'm demonstrating to everyone around me that I don't really believe in myself, or I feel guilty. about not committing all of myself to the game. I'm somehow selling myself short. What I've actually found in my research and some of the research of others is that athletes who do engage in that actually function at a higher level. Their mental well-being is better. And research out of Australia shows that those athletes even perform at a higher level in their sport. So now we're kind of demystifying and creating a new ethos that, developing yourself while you play is a performance edge. It's an advantage. Use it, leverage your athletic exposure and identity to create a wider network, to create wider opportunities, education, perspective, socially. And these are some of the protective factors that will guide you through that transition. Still will be rocky. The potholes are all over the place. For us out there, whether, it's just so many things in your life change, whether it's, just even you look at something like relationships with your spouse, partner, and children, something that changes significantly, how to set a schedule, how to orient what was a good day and what wasn't. Was I productive today or wasn't I? A lot of those metrics have to change, and getting support and perspective is critically important in doing that. So we continually encourage players, and there's more and more stories of it out there. You don't have to look far to see athletes who are leveraging their athletic exposure. I like to call it, to use a business analogy, I think these guys are the CEOs of their own brand. They're CEOs of their own company, and they drive outcomes. They're just not passive recipients of being athletes and whatever will happen. They actually have a keen awareness of what their purpose is and what drives them, and use their athletic platform to connect to that.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that, because you see, I don't know who the NHL equivalent would be, but you see people like LeBron James and Serena Williams, who are their own brands, who have various interests. Like LeBron James is making movies, he's building schools, he's doing everything while still performing at an elite level. And I guess, we all are products to a certain degree of the images we've seen, the messages we've received growing up, and into our adulthood, and role modeling to a large extent. Like, that could be a big shift for even players, because you do have even somebody in small town Canada, you do have a network in order to start planning. Like, your level of celebrity or whatever the power, the influence you have should provide you some opportunities to start branching out in other interests.
Yeah, I found that the true resilience is the expanded self-concept, right? That's where the efficacy, I have something to offer the world other than, this unique and amazing ability to perform within a very small construct, right, of sport. But that feeling is very contagious for players. And once they meaningfully contribute to something outside the game, then the ball is gone, right? They're on their way. You get a taste of that. And, in my experience, we're looking at, parsing this out and using some empirical support to actually see that, but that is what buffers against the stresses and the ups and downs of the game, where we see, players who are exclusively, athletic identity focused and don't demonstrate a great deal of career development outside, tend to struggle the most on their mental well-being. They have fewer things to be positive about, and they're usually hung on the results of a game, which, largely are out of your control. So, we're looking to further bolster that, and how we can achieve that for players, and building that resilience through a diversified identity, which doesn't take away from the athletic aspect in one bit. I think that's a real thing, and I think it's important coming from a former athlete too, because I'm just not talking what I think or what I've read. Like, I lived it, right? And I say this to players. I talk to them player to player. I say, listen, I did this when I played. I didn't miss a team dinner. I knew everything that was going on. I had so much fun. I didn't actually have to give that much. I just structured my time in a way and kept my eye on the prize, using some of those natural transferable athletic skills, the discipline, the determination, the competitiveness that got me to this level. I just applied them to education in a way, and structured my life in a way that created that balance. And I accumulated so many benefits from that. Whether I had a good game or bad game, I went home and studied, and I felt great about it. I felt great about myself. And it negated a lot of the negative impacts, and it distanced myself from over investing in the good times, which are at best transitory in professional sports.
And there's lots of different paths, right? If your path is education and somebody else isn't, there are lots of different ways to get to a constructive
That's right.
plan moving forward, right?
That's the beauty of the game, and that's where we start to see the individuality of the players and connecting to what's important to them. It could be philanthropy. Guys are very interested in things like real estate development, right? Both commercial and residential. Guys are interested in like unique companies and unique causes, environmentalism. There's a whole bunch of causes that may resonate with the individual that your athletic platform may give you an opportunity to explore more fully. You combine that with gaining a little bit of industry knowledge, and strategically doing some stuff in that space, and you all of a sudden have put yourself in a position to create something or do something that you never thought possible.
It was just a couple, answers ago when we were talking about the transition to, former player and how difficult that is. Justin Smoke, who used to play Major League Baseball for several teams, including the Blue Jays, he's retired, and his wife posted something on social media I thought was funny, and I wonder if you can relate to it or know people who can relate to it. So she started working. They have kids. She started, she's picked up a job. Kids were sick, and she describes like having to explain to her husband that he has to cancel his golf game in order to stay home with the kids, and how difficult a conversation that was. And I laugh because, somebody like Justin Smoke or any professional athlete, especially when you have a family, like you are the center of the universe for so long, right? Like where they live depends on where you got traded to or where the opportunities are. You're being able to come home and have a nap in the middle of the day while your kids are not sleeping and different things like that. Like, you really are the center of the universe for, even if it's not at the team level, but in your family unit. And then you have to adjust to no longer being the center of the universe. So it could be difficult for a lot of players.
Yeah, you make a great point in describing it that, and somewhat paints athletes as a touch juvenile and egocentric,
but they need to be. They need to be,
and we need to be. You're right, and you bring in a really important aspect. I touched on it very briefly, but the familial component, right, and how relationships are reorganized. Everyone has a different work-life dynamic, right? In Justin's case, his wife is going back and pursuing and establishing a career, which could have been part of their plan, and how you meaningfully do that and communicate. It's a family decision. There's a lot of moving parts, certainly with children as well. And it really forces you, at least in my experience, to, like I said, what's a productive day and what isn't a productive day? I'm always drawn to that. Like, an athlete can go to, the rink or the field for 2 hours that day and then come home and do nothing else and somehow feel productive. And then I see other athletes, they did, some work, and they picked the kids up, took them to practice, had, dinner with the family, and then they lie in bed at night and can't believe they didn't do anything with their lives. It's just this restructuring and reorganizing of the values and what's important and what you're valuable for, is that critical piece, and being open to that. And, there is resistance in that, but also, having the courage to embrace that as well. Is a critical aspect to adapting effectively, is an openness to that change, and not necessarily resisting it entirely. So yeah, it is one of the things, like, you certainly need to start over, and that's a difficult thing too for athletes. Like, how many other jobs are you the expert top 0.01% in your field at 21?
Yeah.
Like, the idea of learning something new is incredibly frustrating when you're used to being an expert and making something happen to which most people couldn't make happen. Like, there's few surgeons who are 20 years old rocking the top of their specialization, no psychologists or psychiatrists, right? So, having that humility to learn something new can also be a challenge, and giving guys the confidence to do that. Certainly, I can speak to that from my experience. Becoming a counselor, there was a lot I didn't know, and there's a lot I still don't know. As my supervisor, Shelly McAllister, said, if you're not comfortable walking around with a textbook for the next 30 years, you're not going to like doing this very much. So good thing I am, but it did always remind me to have the courage to admit what I don't know, and the vulnerability to ask questions and expose yourself. It's not the end of the world. You actually have far more to gain from that position than always feeling you need to be the expert.
I'm guessing, like most people in psychology, you don't wear one hat you probably have a few things on the go. What are some of the things, whether it's education or work that you're doing besides what you do with the NHLPA?
Oh yeah, sure. I have certainly the consulting is a great place, getting to work with professional athletes and elite amateur athletes is wonderful, and consulting. One area that I will definitely touch on because it has a Whitby connection is about 5 years ago, me and five friends started the Whitby Watch Company, which is a micro-brand watch company that's founded right in our hometown of Whitby, Ontario. And the mission of the Whitby Watch Company is to tell stories of Canadian excellence and great Canadians through the art of watchmaking and celebrating Canada and taking Canada to the world. We find that watchmaking is a wonderful platform to tell Canadian. It's a very Canadian way to be proud, isn't it? It's subtle, but if you notice it, we'll talk about it all day long. And we've had some great success in our community, telling stories of Sir William Stevenson, shores on Lake Ontario. So was Camp X, World War II, and he was the man called Intrepid. So our first line was about the Intrepid and continually to tell the story of intrepid Canadians. We've had an opportunity to tell the Avro Arrow story as well and share that with the world, share it with Americans and Australians. It's amazing how many people are connected to the Avro family connections once, twice removed, uncles, aunts, grandparents who worked on the project, and it really touches a lot of Canadians. So anybody out there who's looking for a unique gift that's undoubtedly Canadian, I suggest you check out Whitby Watch Company. It's a very cool project that I'm learning a lot about the manufacturing industry, certainly the watch one, and it's a passion project that I love very much. But it does keep me on my toes, and it does, like you said, keeps me versatile and always engaged in new things.
Yeah, it seems like that's a theme for you, right? You move into one thing, but you're always learning something completely different on the other side.
Yeah, there is. There's a versatility to me. I like to say I like to see myself as versatile and do a lot of different things in a day. But I actually stumbled against that in my transition. I'm like, well, what the heck is the theme here? I was partners with a friend, and we had a supplement that treated concussions. We had an exit from that company, but and I had the help and support of people around me. I have the mental health, all of these things. There's an underlying theme, right? There's a supportive developmental theme in that, and in bringing a certain story, and whether it's through inspiration, mentorship, or insightful leadership, to holistically see the potential in people that they may not necessarily see in themselves at that time. And I feel what I've learned from the greatest coaches I've played for. I've been lucky enough to play for some of the best. Hall of Famer Pat Quinn was my first NHL coach, and a huge mentor of mine was Paul Maurice. Played for him almost most of my NHL games.
Mm-hmm.
Is the first step in being an effective coach or mentor is seeing something in someone that they don't see in themselves yet. And you can't guess. You have to actually see it. It has to be there, but you have to be able to manufacture that confidence for them to realize what they may not understand is realizable yet. So oftentimes that is a huge aspect of my mission and motivation, whether I'm working with 10-year-old softball players or I'm working with professional athletes. It's my job to find the beauty in you and the gifts in you and shape them in a way that you can fully realize their potential and do whatever you want.
Just as you mentioned, like young athletes, sports for youth can be tricky, right? In today's world, just with, we've hinted like specialization and how, it's certainly not what I remember as a child, being exposed to several different sports. It's a lot of times, especially in these parts, hockey becomes the primary focus really early on. And do you have advice for parents when it comes to, managing expectations, that desire to be an athlete, whether it's elite or not, and balancing kind of the mental health piece of it?
Yeah, this is tricky is a great word for it, Darryl. I have a lot of thoughts as as a former athlete, as a child athlete, and my experiences, and now as a father of four, with athletes in the house as well. Spent a lot of time reflecting on it, and it's a difficult time. It's not fair to judge what it was like when we were kids, or even the generation before us, when youth athletes was about athleticism. generally speaking, an effective athlete could make any team based on their athleticism. Usually they could run, jump, shoot, and have the hand-eye coordination that got them through a tryout to get access to an elite training environment. Now, the hyper specialization of sport is now teams aren't picked on athleticism; they're picked on skill development, right? And you're watching a 11-year-old hockey tryout, and they're talking about hockey IQ, right? That's a very different thing. That maybe some kids who are good athletes and have potential will not get access to those environments anymore. So it's this real catch-22 for parents, is that in order to get my kids access to the highest development, they need to do this 24 hours a day, basically, which makes it difficult. Now I have to make a choice at 8 years old what my child's sport is going to be, and that's the exact opposite of what I want for them. But I also see they have athletic potential. So in this, so you feel you have to give something. Either I'm going to have to take away from their athletic development and potential in order to create a more balanced sports experience, right? Or I'm going to sacrifice that balanced sports experience to get the maximum out of them. It's a no-win situation. It becomes very difficult. And what I encourage parents to do, I stole the line from finance. It's KYC, right? Know your client. That's what they say all the time. I hear these finance guys saying. Well, I use the KYC too. I say know your child. Not every child needs the most competitive environment to effectively get what they need out of sports. Some kids do, and they'll usually let you know who they are quite easily. But not every person needs to play sport at the highest level and elite level to get all they need out of sport. We all have different things, and sometimes parents' perception of what that might be would be very different. And that's a whole other conflict, that your children are here to fulfill their lives, not yours. And the old, if someone would have given me this much opportunity, then I would have somehow done more with it. Overcoming and battling those demons is a critically important piece to being a mindful sport parent. But recognize, what do you want your children to get out of sport? What do you want? And be honest with that. And then also be honest with what that's going to cost, not just from a financial perspective, but what's that going to cost emotionally, developmentally? What's the opportunity cost going to be to that child? And being consistent and being true to it and being disciplined with it. It's one of the hardest things to do as well. So, and again, it's a path made by walking. I don't claim to have the recipe in how you navigate an increasingly professionalized youth sport environment, which is incredibly transactional, where if a kid's not good, then there's no point in playing, which is clearly not why sports is part of society and has been for thousands of years. If it was only reserved for the very best people, it's for everybody for a reason. So, finding that medium and that developmental balance, and is my kid getting what they need and meeting those challenges appropriately? Are they being challenged in a way that it's not too easy, but certainly not detrimental to their overall global development? And are they missing other things that I think are important? It's an honest conversation I think all parents have to have with themselves, which maybe sometimes goes underexplored.
Yeah, but it's really tough too, because that area is so consumerized right now, right? And it's easy as a parent to get caught up, right? When somebody's organizing something, and like they need to do this, they need to do this, and then there's an engine behind the scenes because they're trying to meet targets and revenues, not necessarily produce elite athletes. Some of these businesses out there, right?
It's really hard. All the kids on the team are getting this training or using this, like. You're left with that feeling that, am I not doing right by my child? Am I not giving them the opportunity they need to succeed? So, sometimes I look back, and at least I try to cope with that as like, well, in my sport, we would find the players wherever they were. I remember, like, go ask some of the Russians what kind of exposure they had to when they were young. I mean, they'll go find kids in Magnitogorsk, Russia, who can play with, barely have any equipment on. You don't necessarily need $1,000 stick or bat to hit the ball. You probably just need something, right? And allow the child to develop and shape the course of their own development. Doesn't mean you let anything go, and certainly finding points to create opportunities for development and teachable moments is critical when it comes to values that are important to you. whether it relates to, commitment, training, teamwork, accountability, things like that. Confidence, certainly those are the areas that sport allows us to challenge and grow. But it's a dynamic, and it's a two-way, and it has to be received and fed from both the parent and the child in a way for it to be sustainable and ultimately healthy.
Yeah. And there's also a good idea to have some math knowledge about, how many people like yourself actually get to live out their dreams, right? Like
a friend of mine, he said he go to a group and ask, how many athletes get, Division I scholarships, and nobody knows. And it's like roughly 0.08 or something. Like, okay, so anybody hoping for that, you should probably cross that off your list as the outcome you're looking for. And then he's like, how many people get, STEM scholarships, academic scholarships? And the numbers are closer to 8%. And so how many of you spent $10,000 on math and science this year?
Yeah.
Right?
Zero.
If you're playing the odds of a scholarship, a math tutor is probably far more effective than a skating or hitting coach. Yeah. And getting a return on that investment. So again, that's part of that being honest component, which is very hard to do. But it's a funny analogy. You'll spend way more developing an athlete than you'll ever get in scholarship money.
Yeah.
It better be about more than that.
Yes. Well, and you can't live out your kids' dreams, right? And I think that's what parents, we get caught up in. We want our kids to succeed and have opportunities, and then we have a group of people that are telling us, if you do this, they'll be better. If you do this, they'll be better. And it's like
that's a tough one. I've often tried to parse out that, because sometimes people, phrase it as, oh, you don't live through your children, but I sometimes take pause in that, because in many ways that's a very healthy thing to do. In many ways, that's part of having children, is living through their happiness, right? Whether it's through their experiences, through their successes, and through their lives, it's totally okay to fully invest yourself. You don't have to be distanced from your children's success. You can be very much a part of it and experience through them. It's when you conflate your own success or your own sense of, failure, and it's equated to your child's. And when those two things become inherently linked, then you may be overinvested in not necessarily living through it in the most adaptive way that's healthy for both yourself and the child. So totally cool. I love the idea of living through my children's successes and watching them and being a part of that. But when their failures become reflections of me and I have resentment towards them, because of that inability to perform at a level that I think they're capable of, or that they need to be capable of to continue their development, then it starts to become something a little less than what it could be, and probably would be considered healthy.
No, that's great advice. It's been fun chatting with you. We could talk about this and other subjects for much longer, but I appreciate you taking the time, and good luck with everything you're doing, not only in hockey, but in mental health and the rest of and watchmaking and the rest of your endeavors.
Well, I appreciate it very much. Thank you for the opportunity. Like I say, I'm so privileged to have the opportunity to be a part of the Shores family for a year and get the experience invaluable. It fundamentally changed who I was personally and professionally, and I hold a lot of those relationships very dear. So it's a wonderful place that does wonderful work.
Thanks, Jay. Take care.
Cool. Have a great one. Thanks, Josh.
Begins and ends with